Well, good evening and welcome to this month's February 16th, 2024 Ask Your Herb Doctor on KMUD Garberville 91.1 FM and on the web at www.kmud.org. We're also live streaming the program to our Western Botanical Medicine YouTube channel, so you can listen live right now on our channel by searching Western Botanical Medicine in the search bar on the YouTube and click on the live stream. So tonight's radio show is a continuation of anti-inflammatories for gastrointestinal disorders, but I'm going to carry on last month's rushed exit of the stunning piece of Japanese research that was done by scientists and published regarding glucose uptake by heart muscle, explaining away the vaccine-related sudden deaths. And there's lots more coming out from a very prominent cardiologist in England, in conjunction with the usual scientists in the field, shouting from the hilltops or the rooftops and in the wilderness, as it were, for people to wake up and listen. And that's what I believe this show's always been about. I want to say it's impartial and non-political. But obviously there are things that we have gotten to learn, and life's all about learning new things. And so, as Dr. Pete and us would always comment, be careful where you get your facts from, because there's a lot of that these days. And obviously, with ChatGPT being involved in just about everything now, it's coming on so quickly. Most of the searching that you do online, or the articles that you look at or have been printed, have actually been generated by AI. Okay, so without further ado, my name's Andrew Murray.
My name's Sarah Johannesson Murray. Welcome to this evening's show.
We're both licensed medical herbalists who consult with clients with a wide range of conditions. Our website's westernbotanicalmedicine.com. You can also visit the site to see a list of organic medicinal herb tinctures, and our contact details are there also. Alternatively, we can be reached on our toll-free number 1-888-WBM-HERB. And our Western Botanical Medicine Twitter account, the handle there is at WBM Herb, and our YouTube channel is Western Botanical Medicine. And links to both our Twitter and YouTube channel are also on our website. So, the GI tract and gastrointestinal disease. I'll just start the way I meant to start, but I don't want to just carry on with that before I get into the medicinal herbs that are used in the treatment of inflammatory bowel disease and intestinal, inflammation in general. I wanted to quote this. And the quote is, "When you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." And this concept of what is truth has become a bit of a mantra for me personally, just because I'm quite interested in some of the etymology of this. And as some people, perhaps it's not a religious show, I just want to put that out there right now, but I'm not defending myself. As some of you out there probably understood, Pontius Pilate retorted to Jesus' claim when he said that my kingdom is not of this world, whereupon Pilate said, "You are a king then?" And then Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." Now, 2,000 years ago, Pilate retorted, "What is truth?" And it's a very important and relevant question today in the age of information, and as importantly, misinformation. Do we want the truth of a matter or not? I would argue that if questioned or polled on the question, overwhelmingly the response would be virtually everyone would choose truth. Would you? If not, why not, should be the next question. And what would motivate a person to not want the truth or to know the truth of any matter? Have we not been given free will? So with reference to the topic of this month's show, what is truth? I'll continue this after we cover the herbs related to gastrointestinal diseases, but the discussion and debate rages on, hosted by scientists worldwide, including Dr. Robert Malone, inventor of the RMNA platform, which spawned the experimental drug used against the COVID-19 outbreak, Dr. Peter McCulloch, Dr. Geert van den Bosch, and many other critical thinkers of this age. So for the last couple of shows, we've covered gastrointestinal disorders, and yes, the show's title is Ask Your Herb Doctor, and principally the alternative treatment of disease is where we're focused. So I covered those acronyms that are used in medical circles to describe various pathologies that people are afflicted with, and so I mentioned SIBO, a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and then IMO, which is a kind of intestinal methanogen overgrowth. This is kind of another subclass of it, produced, or rather caused, by a species of organism called Methanobrevibacter smithii. And this is mainly the methane-producing archaea. So that's SIBO and IMO, and then SIFO, which is small intestinal fungal overgrowth. This is basically when there's an excessive number of fungal organisms in the small intestine associated with GI symptoms. Obviously, Candida is one of the more common ones. IBS, irritable bowel disease, and irritable bowel syndrome. And then the true inflammatory bowel disorders, both Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. So looking at the treatment of these in terms of herbs and herbal medicines, I mentioned that, well, it's not as simple as that, but essentially people with SIBO can fall into two distinct categories, those that are typically constipated and those that typically are not constipated, even though they may have the distension and bloating and gas production that is associated with a deranged floral species that they shouldn't have in the small intestine. So obviously those kind of herbs that are useful and or called or classed as laxatives are definitely useful in mitigating constipation, because it's obviously very distressing when people can't evacuate properly and they backed up for 2 or 3 days or even longer in some cases. It's not uncommon, but obviously there's lots of toxic waste that is being reabsorbed, and all of that definitely poisons the system. So there is that kind of endotoxin based resorption which adds to the burden of the organism dealing with this. So the laxatives, obviously Cascara sagrada is a real favorite, and then obviously things like Cassia senna, or even Turkey rhubarb is fairly extreme and more of a cathartic, but slippery elm powder or the psyllium seeds, those kind of mucilaginous herbs, and then obviously other mucilaginous herbs like slippery elm and marshmallow. So we mentioned some of those other herbs that were used particularly in SIBO, things like berberis and the berberine alkaloids. Those are found commonly in things like Mahonia, the Oregon grapefruit, could be found in golden seal, Coptis root, Coptis chinensis, which is a kind of Chinese version of golden seal. But those berberine alkaloids have a pretty strongly antibacterial action, and for hydrogen dominant forms of SIBO, they will be bactericidal. And we mentioned things like oregano and the oil of oregano, especially when it's used as an enteric coated capsule to get past the stomach's acid effect and get into the small intestine where it can break down. And there, oregano, with its powerful range of terpenes, monoterpenes, diterpenes, triterpenes, as part of the essential oil family, the Labiati, containing herbs, those are also very useful in reducing populations that have a direct bactericidal effect. And then the good old herb favourite, garlic, and particularly the company in England, Alimax, that produce the allicin capsules, tablets, and other preparations of garlic. That's also very useful as an antibacterial, particularly for SIBO in this case. And so there's a range of either volatile oils or terpenes, mono, di, triterpenes that are antibacterial There's the oregano, as I mentioned, and then also things that are bacteriostatic or bactericidal, the berberine alkaloids. So those are
Well, and also hydrastine from Hydrastis canadensis, which is golden seal, that will have a lot of the same activities as the berberine, containing Oregon grapefruit and also the berberis, the barberry. All of those have a lot of the same chemicals. It's a very orange substance that comes from Oregon grapefruit and golden seal, as well as from barberry.
So getting on to some more kind of in-depth discussion on some of these herbs for the treatment of both irritable bowel disease and inflammatory bowel disease. When you think about the GI tract passing all of the contents of the digested food from the stomach through to the anus, you think about a place that is ultimately dealing with the waste products after anything good has been absorbed in the early part of the small intestine from the food that's all digested and turned into a soup in the stomach. So the main reason we eat food is to obviously gain the nutrition from it, or the vitamins and or any of the other components based on the carbohydrate, protein or fat content of it that our body uses as fuel. So the waste obviously has to be dealt with, and the colon principally harbors the billions and billions of organisms which form, funnily enough, the greater portion of the mass of feces. So we actually reduce our food down to a very small size if you look at it separately from the bacterial mass that is there in the stool. So the chronic inflammatory diseases can be divided into two subcategories. So these are the truly inflammatory diseases, so both ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. And in both cases, there's a significant inflammation throughout the gastrointestinal tract. The exact cause of inflammatory bowel disease, the exact cause is kind of largely unknown. There's lots of speculation about its etiology, but researchers believe it to be the result of a weakened immune system. And one hypothesis is that the immune system responds incorrectly to environmental triggers, such as virus or bacteria exposure, which causes inflammation throughout the gastrointestinal tract. There is also thought to be a genetic component, as there is some tendency for it to run in families, but that's, I think that's kind of disputable. I think the epigenetic variability will give people certainly plenty of opportunity to mitigate that. Just because your parents or siblings have had inflammatory bowel disease doesn't mean to say that you will get it if you're eating correctly, because I think largely the diet and lifestyle is very supportive of healthy bowels and healthy GI tract function. So in the United States, there's approximately 500,000 people suffering from Crohn's at the moment, and about 600,000 suffering with ulcerative colitis. Now, while inflammatory bowel disease usually occurs between the ages of 15 to 30, there is a chance for adolescents to develop it, and a 10 to 15% chance people will develop it after the age of 60. And research indicates that females are slightly more likely to develop Crohn's disease. It shows up, incidentally, more commonly in colder developed regions of the world. So getting on to anti-inflammatory herbs of choice. Turmeric, obviously, is one of those herbs that comes to mind pretty quickly. It's been used, obviously, in great amounts in Asia and India. I should have looked up the incidence of inflammatory bowel disease in that country and extrapolated that data and seen if there was any link or suggestion to say that turmeric in the diets of these people could be partially responsible for lowered incidence. But I believe the incidence is lower in Asia, and I think these spices are largely responsible for it. So looking at a trial observing patients with dormant ulcerative colitis, because it can have relapsing and remitting cycles of inflammation, they found that curcumin capsules, which is the main ingredient, the active ingredient for which turmeric is quoted, significantly reduced inflammation in the bowel, and this effectively reduced the risk of a relapse for those that received turmeric capsules, specifically with curcumin. Another study involving participants with ulcerative proctitis, which is a mild form of ulcerative colitis, and Crohn's disease, discovered that the administration of curcumin for 3 months significantly reduced the severity of inflammation. Researchers saw improvements in multiple gut health biomarkers, including the frequency of bowel movement, the formation of stool, and a decrease in abdominal cramping and pain. Curcumin is the principal curcuminoid of the popular South Asian spice turmeric, which is a member of the ginger family. An open-label pilot study in 10 adults with ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease documented improvement of symptoms with oral intake of 550 milligrams of curcumin 3 times a day. And curcumin was shown by Hanea et al. To be effective for relapse prevention in adult patients with ulcerative colitis in a randomized, multi-center, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. And a pilot pediatric study of curcumin in 11 patients showed good tolerability of the drug with only one documented side effect, which was gas production. All participants in this pilot study received 500 milligrams of curcumin twice a day for 3 weeks, and with use of the forced dose titration design, doses were increased up to 1 gram twice a day at week 3 for a total of 3 weeks, and then titrated again to 2 grams twice a day at week 6 for 3 weeks. So by using the Pediatric Crohn's Disease Activity Index and Pediatric Ulcerative Colitis Activity Index, which are validated measures of disease activity, scores were obtained at week 3, 6, and 9. So 3 patients saw improvement in their scores with the use of curcumin. Curcumin is well tolerated and does not cause significant side effects. There are some small side effects, obviously, as with most things, from stomach upset to dizziness and some cases of diarrhea. Now, curcumin may inhibit platelet aggregation and increase the risk of bleeding, which is another thing to be aware of. So they do recommend that typically pre-surgery, people that are using or having chronic use of curcumin should discontinue it for a week or so prior to surgical procedures.
And I just want to mention that curcumin is the active ingredient in turmeric. I know you mentioned that earlier, but just to reiterate that these studies were done with turmeric root.
So you're listening to Ask Your Herb Doctor on KMUD Garberville 91.1 FM on the web at kmud.org. From 7:30 till the end of the show, we'll be taking callers, either related to this month's continuing subject of gastrointestinal disease and herbs, or any other questions related to alternative medicine. Okay, so continuing on from curcumin, boswellia. This is actually this is an herb that I probably only started using about 2 years ago, although obviously frankincense has had a 2,000 year biblical recorded and probably pre-2,000 year history of use. So I mentioned earlier in the discussion about volatile oils and terpenes, I mentioned terpenes and triterpenic acids, but these are very much present in boswellia. Obviously, it's not in the labiati, but it's another compound for which it contains a lot of these terpenes and triterpenic acids.
So boswellia is the Latin name for frankincense, and actually, Andrew, you have been using frankincense resin for incense ever since I met you.
Well, yeah,
it's a very long time. But medicinally, as a tincture,
yeah.
You've only started making frankincense tincture a couple years ago.
Yeah. So there is some debate as to the sustainability also. That's obviously a buzzword. It has certainly become a buzzword in the last 20 years in herbal medicine because of quote-unquote overcollection and wild populations being threatened, which I can understand is very real, especially when there's a huge demand for particular products. It's just like whales and whale blubber and other products from animals that have caused a great amount of debate as to banning the practice. So yeah, obviously, we like to support sustainable agriculture. We are I'm sure at least 94% certified organic in everything that we manufacture. So we purchase certified organic raw materials, and obviously there's no wild collecting danger to a certified organic product because it's grown specifically for that use. So yeah, frankincense has had thousands of years of use, and obviously, like I said, it was mentioned as one of those three herbs in biblical texts from gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, myrrh also is another resin and produced by another tree, indigenous to a very similar location. And myrrh is also being used as a incredibly good antiseptic, antibacterial, used for topical infections, boils and furunculosis and that kind
And
of
it's
thing.
also antifungal.
Yeah,
Myrrh resin is also antifungal.
yeah. So frankincense, specifically in the context of inflammatory bowel disease, has had quite a bit of research done on it, and just wanted to share this with you. So in a trial involving patients with ulcerative colitis, researchers found that there was a significant reduction in chronic inflammation after administering 350 milligrams of boswellia 3 times a day for 6 weeks.
So that's the frankincense.
Yeah, the frankincense. 82% of individuals taking the resin went into remission, while only 75% of patients taking the placebo went into remission. So interestingly, people taking a placebo went into remission too. So it's quote unquote, I think there's also something to be lent to the fact that people are taking something for something, that something happens. Anyway.
Well, it has to have more than 50% efficacy. Otherwise, it's the same as placebo. I think placebo's efficacy is 50%.
So an in vitro test tube study found that boswellia extract reduced inflammation in cell cultures. Along with the anti-inflammatory effect, the extract was also able to protect healthy cells against inflammation. And boswellia serrata, or frankincense, is commonly used around the world for inflammatory bowel disease. And in adults, the boswellia dosage is generally 300 to 400 milligrams 3 times daily of an extract that contains 37.5% boswellic acid. So it's almost a third containing these acids. In a German study, because the Germans are pretty big on herbal medicine with their Commission E monographs, their study in adults with inflammatory bowel disease showed 36% were taking boswellia serrata extracts. One study by Gupta et al. Showed that 30 patients with chronic ulcerative colitis showed that boswellia, the frankincense, achieved remission in 14 out of 20 patients, and also that it was similar to a compound known as sulfasalazine in the UC remission rate. So the remission rate of frankincense was similar to sulfasalazine, which is used in the treatment of inflammatory bowel disease by regular medicine. And in another study by Gerhardt et al. Concluded that therapy with frankincense extract, and the extract was termed or labeled H15 because somebody probably produced it, they patented it, but they produced it and either trademarked it or logoed it, was not inferior to mesalazine, again, another compound used in the treatment of Crohn's disease. The herb is well tolerated, but one study in 2011 by Hotmayer et al. Didn't find it to be superior to placebo. So all points, all sides taken, not just a one direction here. And as Sue said at the beginning of the show, and it caught my attention, free speech, easy to lose it. So that's why we've always said dialogue is so important, to have both-way dialogue for all sides, you know. And I don't sit here and spout and ascribe herbs as the cure for everything, you know. Sometimes they work really well, sometimes they don't have that much of an impact, and it all depends. Everyone's so different. So let's hear both sides of the story in everything. Okay, it also is noted that frankincense does have some side effects to it, and nausea, diarrhea and skin rashes have been registered. It may also decrease the anti-inflammatory effects of NSAIDs, or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which is quite interesting. Okay, so there's the first two, turmeric and frankincense. And then, strangely enough, and I didn't expect this, because we use a lot of it in our stress formula. But Melissa officinalis lemon balm has got quite a lot of research done and a lot of papers written on it for its use in the treatment of inflammatory bowel disease, and probably because of its quote unquote gentle sedative effects. But again, Melissa is in the labiate, and it does contain lots of volatile oils, and these volatile oils, again, like the terpenes mono, terpenes di, and triterpenes, and the boswellic acids in frankincense, all have antimicrobial effects. So they're totally documented and irrefutable. So lemon balm's a versatile aromatic herb. It's been long used for its relaxing effects on the GI tract. It's helpful for relieving those symptoms of irritable bowel disease. In a combination study, participants with irritable bowel disease at this point were given a herbal blend containing lemon balm, spearmint, another labiate, and coriander 3 times per day for 8 weeks. Subjects experienced less pain and discomfort, as well as a decrease in the frequency and severity of bloating. An animal study found that lemon balm extract has the ability to reduce pain in the GI tract, as well as improve gut health in rats with IBS. Researchers believe a lemon balm's anti-inflammatory properties are responsible for this effect. Now, the German commissionee, which you mentioned, and the European Medicines Agency both indicate that lemon balm is effective for individuals with gastrointestinal issues.
So I wonder if that's the water-soluble fraction of lemon balm or the oil. It's probably the oil fraction that is anti-inflammatory, like it is with chamomile.
Yeah.
And it is important to note, if people want to use lemon balm, it's best to use fresh lemon balm leaves. They grow like a weed in the garden. And to make sure that you have a tight fitting lid on your teapot, because you don't want the essential oil steaming off of your tea. Dried lemon balm will have an antiviral activity as a dried leaf brewed into a tea, but you need to have the fresh lemon balm in order to have the anti-anxiety effect and probably also the anti-inflammatory effect for the bowels. We produce a fresh lemon balm tincture so that it's chopped up and put immediately into alcohol to preserve and to save the essential oil, which is the anti-anxiety portion of lemon balm, and that's in our de-stress formula.
So to carry on with okay, well, let's finish up with lemon balm. I don't think there's anything else more to say that I have here, because I was looking at cinnamon next. So cinnamon, again, it's not one of those herbs that I would traditionally think, but obviously as an antidiarrheal, certainly would. So it's widely known for its culinary use, but its anti-inflammatory properties make it one of the most supportive herbs, for irritable bowel disease, and it makes it one of the top herbs for intestinal inflammation. Again, the tannins, classically when we were trained, tannins were definitely quoted as anti-inflammatory because in the analogy of the wound on the skin suppurating the plasma that you will see if you ran a cheese grater over the top of the fist of a hand, as well as obviously leaking blood. After a while, you'd have this kind of yellow ooze that's coming out, and that plasma, that is typically something that you could put a tannin on, and that tannin would precipitate the protein in the plasma and turn it into an eschar. And that eschar essentially was a sterilizing surface through which bacteria wouldn't be able to get into the skin from the wound. So I can totally understand how tannins in that respect could have that anti-inflammatory effect because of how they react with proteins and how they essentially form this kind of eschar.
Yeah, it's like helping the scab become more anti-infective.
Yeah. So an animal study discovered that cinnamon essential oil, this is the oil that's distilled from the bark, has the ability to reduce inflammatory symptoms involved with inflammatory bowel disease. And researchers found that cinnamon's antimicrobial properties may also reduce the severity of inflammatory bowel disease as well as promote gut health. And another animal trial found that cinnamon extract and one of its main active constituents, cinnamaldehyde, was able to reduce inflammation in cases of ulcerative colitis. The extract also reduced the number of biomarkers that create fibroids in the gastrointestinal tract. So, an in vitro, again, test tube study discovered that cinnamon extract has the ability to inhibit the inflammatory response, and the extract was able to reduce inflamed tissue of the gut by regulating T cells. Now, the German Commissionee, 1998, approved cinnamon bark for gastrointestinal health, including for bloating, flatulence, and loss of appetite. And additionally, the European Scientific Cooperative on Phytotherapy and the European Medicines Agency note that cinnamon bark is helpful for treating those experiencing mild diarrhea. And we mentioned the fact that the tannins in the bark of cinnamon are responsible for that effect. So moving on to ginger. Ginger is well known around the world, and obviously in Asia they eat a lot of ginger. It's one of those rhizomes, again, one of the most well-known herbs for irritable bowel disease and other gastrointestinal issues. In an animal study, ginger extract was able to reduce inflammation in rats with IBS. The extract, specifically the gingerol content, decreased pro-inflammatory markers which could help reduce severe chronic inflammation caused by IBS. In a pilot study, 45 participants with IBS found less than effective results when comparing the placebo to the ginger group. Now, researchers noted, however, that a larger trial with ginger could potentially produce effective trends due to the study's encouraging data. And the European Medicines Agency mentions that ginger is a supportive therapeutic option for mild complaints of the gut. I mentioned slippery elm earlier. Slippery elm, known as Ulmus fulva, is a supplement made from the powdered bark of a slippery elm tree that's being used in inflammatory bowel disease. Obviously, it's used for reflux esophagitis as one of the first places that I came into contact with it. Although it's not been studied in humans, an in vitro study by Langmead et al. Showed that slippery elm has antioxidant effects. The study also showed that devil's claw, Mexican yam, tormentil, and other traditional Chinese medicines have antioxidant properties. Obviously, lots and lots of antioxidants in many different herbs.
So a lot of these herbs that are have the essential oil and the calming effect on the intestines, one way in which they work is through lowering the serotonin levels. So an irritated intestine will produce a lot of serotonin, and that's that flush feeling you can get if you're very nauseous, and like when your car's sick or for other reasons, your body's producing a lot of serotonin, and a lot of the mechanism by which these herbs work to decrease inflammation in your intestines is by lowering the serotonin. Because I think it's Dr. Pete would quote 90% of the serotonin produced in your body is produced by your intestinal tract, and obviously you don't want too much because serotonin is actually quite inflammatory. It's not the hormone that we've been told is a happy sunshine hormone. It's actually a very inflammatory response to injury and irritation and inflammation.
Okay, so it's 7:30, 7:34 in fact. So from now until the end of the show, callers are invited to call in with any questions related or unrelated. 707-923-3911 the number. So last month, I had to wrap up very quickly an excellent paper that was produced by Japanese scientists in, I think it was November of 23, that was then picked up and examined and turned into a presentation by a British cardiologist. It was very medically oriented. It's not at all an alternative medicine practitioner. It's a very
standard cardiologist.
Yeah, very standard cardiologist with a white coat and everything else you'd expect from a cardiologist. Probably does a very good job as well. But anyway, he's very objective. And I mentioned at the very beginning of the show about truth. He's very objective about data and where the data's coming from. And he's a critical thinker, which is really, really important in medicine. And unfortunately, I think as time's gone on, doctors and thinkers are being railroaded by very, very powerful corporate invested machines. So whether it's the lobbyists or whether it's education for doctors or whether it's seminars and other other things that are put on to entice doctors into using particular drugs. I don't know, but obviously the money is a big part of it. And Dr. Pete would always quote this saying that a lie gets around the world quicker than truth can tie her shoelaces. And in keeping with the beginning of what I was saying about Jesus' dialogue with Pontius Pilate, and Pontius Pilate said, "What is truth?" You need to be very objective. We've given so much information now, and misinformation, as I've said, but ultimately you can follow the money and you'll see who's selling it and who's not selling it. I wanted to get on to just cover so everyone can understand what the paper that came out of the Japanese scientists in November of last year was all about, and potentially what it could mean without being alarmist about it. Just like this British cardiologist is not alarmist, he's just stating the facts. There are obviously lots of people that have been very shouting from the rooftop about the whole COVID pandemic and the effects of the experimental drug, etc., and the potential long-range effects of it all. But this cardiologist isn't shouting from the rooftop, he's just explaining the data. So he went over this paper. It's called the Assessment of Myocardial 18F FDG Uptake at PET CT in Asymptomatic SARS-CoV-2 Vaccinated and Non-Vaccinated Patients. So I won't go through the whole thing, but what I'll do is I'll just briefly talk about the study and what it revealed. So in Japan, like in America and any other westernized country, PET scans and CT scans are commonly employed for monitoring cancer treatment progression. Okay, so they'll radio label you, they'll inject you with a radio labeled substance that is visible on a PET scan or a CT scan. Okay, in this case it's 18-FDG, which is a fluoroxy glucose. So it's basically a glucose molecule that's radio labeled with a isomer of fluorine 18, and then a CT or a PET scan can pick it up. Now, they took 2 cohorts. They were all cancer patients, all being looked at for treatment and assessment of efficacy of their treatment outcome. So basically, what they decided to do in the beginning of this trial was split these 2 cohorts into vaccinated and unvaccinated groups. So what they noticed, and this British cardiologist pointed out, and he was very interested in it, obviously, because it all centered around the heart.
What was the name of the British cardiologist?
Philip Macmillan. Okay. So what they noted, and these Japanese researchers brought this out in very graphic presentations of the actual PET scans or the CT scans, was what the doctor was talking about was that about 40% of the heart's energy production comes from glucose, and actually the greater percentage of it comes from free fatty acid metabolism. He was just going over basic physiology and showing that a greater amount of ATP is produced by the burning of free fatty acids than is generated by the same weight of glucose. So
the heart burns either glucose or free fatty acids. That's the fuel the heart needs for the cells, the muscle cells of the heart to contract.
Yeah. So basically you get virtually twice as much energy from a gram of free fatty acids as you would a gram of glucose. And so principally the heart uses free fatty acids. So what they found when they looked at these 2 cohorts of patients were that their PET scans showed that the unvaccinated cohorts' hearts were not taking up any of this 18F-FDG, but the vaccinated cohort, all of them, this substance showed up principally in the heart. So he was questioning this. He said, and he's very objective, and he's not an alarmist, and he's not shouting from the rooftops. He's just showing the facts.
Okay, I just want to state here that the radio-labeled injected glucose form that was used is what was taken up in the heart of the vaccinated people, when the heart should mainly be using free fatty acids. But in the vaccinated group of people, the people who'd had the COVID vaccine, their hearts were showing a lot more of this uptake of this radioactive glucose, which shows that that was what their heart was using more than what it normally uses in the unvaccinated people was the free fatty acids. So
Yeah.
that was an abnormal.
Yeah, very abnormal
Finding.
finding. So based on this very abnormal finding, a very objective person looked at the study here, and what has been concluded from the study is that the rate of sudden deaths and heart attack that have definitely increased since the rollout of the vaccines is almost certainly due to the inability of the vaccinated heart to produce sufficient energy in relation to the demand put upon it. So that's why these athletes have been dropping dead. And so, quote unquote, the warning not to get into really extreme aerobic exercise if you have been vaccinated, because this whole PET scan article showed that the heart is now using glucose way more than the free fatty acids it would normally use for producing energy, and that in extreme needs of energy, the heart isn't able to produce enough. So therefore, you get a cramp and a heart attack. The heart's just unable to do it.
And also, too, I mean, Dr. Pete would regularly recommend that the aerobic cardiovascular exercise should be no more than 5 minutes, and then you should switch to a weight-bearing, muscle-building activity to keep the stress hormones down and not to run on stress hormones for more than the 5 minutes of vigorous heart-pumping exercise. So you want to switch it out for another 5 to 10 minutes so your heart rate completely comes back down to normal while you're doing your muscle building, and then you can go back to your 5 minutes of cardio. And that is a good way in general, whether you're vaccinated with the COVID vaccine or not. But what they're finding is that these hearts were not getting enough sugar during strenuous activity because the hearts in the vaccinated individuals were taking up and using mainly glucose. And if you're doing very strenuous cardiovascular exercise, you're going to run out of glucose and you're going to start running on free fatty acids. And the vaccinated group, the hearts in the vaccinated group were unable to use the amount of free fatty acids that they needed. It was primarily wanting to take up glucose. I know that's getting a little technical there, but I hope that's explaining things. Sue, is that making sense? Our engineer is Sue tonight. Our lovely Sue.
So subsequently, then, it's posited that myocarditis and sudden death from cardiac arrest is caused by the vaccine's shift in cardiac energy utilization from free fatty acids to glucose, with its decrease in available energy. And this is a disastrous recipe for the athletic. Okay, so that was the first part of what was beginning to come out last month, and I wanted to follow it up with some more information related to that for this month. Again, we're looking for the truth here, folks. I mean, I don't ever want to sound alarmist, and I think some of what we've done in the past has been alarmist, perhaps, but sometimes you need to shout to get people to hear.
Can I have that piece of paper, please?
Yeah, this one? Okay. All right. So, as I said, the kind of discussion and the debate kind of still rages on. I think, fortunately, or not, a lot of people have just let it go, and the whole COVID thing is just losing traction worldwide, and less people are worried by it. I think as time goes on, and at this point in time, I don't think anything else is being unleashed to grab our attention, especially because we got an election cycle coming up. Now, Dr. Geert Vanden Bossche, he's been fairly vociferous about this from the very beginning, along with McCulloch and several other prominent scientists like Malone, the inventor of the mRNA technology in the first place. Now, he says, in the case of a pandemic, natural immunity, including the trained innate immunity, is far more efficient and safe than vaccine-induced immunity. So current protection of vaccinees against severe disease is fragile and not durable. The best way to protect against severe COVID-19 disease during an immune escape pandemic is therefore not vaccine-induced adaptive immunity, but trained innate immunity. Whereas both cell-based innate immunity and virulence-inhibiting non-neutralizing antibodies are variant non-specific, the cell-based innate immune system is endowed with immunological memory, whereas non-neutralizing antibodies are not. And due to their thoroughly trained cell-based innate immunity, healthy unvaccinated people are now increasingly protected from symptomatic COVID-19 infection regardless of enhanced viral infectiousness and virulence in COVID-19 vaccinees. In conclusion, large-scale natural immunity is required and sufficient to protect an individual from a pandemic virus and to end a natural pandemic. Although both cell-based innate immunity and virulence-inhibiting non-neutralizing antibodies effectively protect against severe disease caused by any SARS-CoV-2 variant, only trained cell-based innate immunity has a durable sterilizing effect. This is why healthy unvaccinated individuals are now largely protected from symptomatic infection and critically contribute to herd immunity. Highly pathogenic human respiratory coronaviruses cause acute lethal disease characterized by exuberant inflammatory response and lung damage. However, the factors leading to lung pathology are not well understood, and using mice infected with SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome virus, we show that robust virus replication accompanied by delayed type 1 interferon signaling orchestrates inflammatory responses and lung immunopathology with diminished survival. So interferon 1 remains detectable until after virus titers peak, but early interferon 1 administration ameliorates immunopathology. So it's the early interferon response that is beneficial. So the delayed interferon 1 signaling promotes the accumulation of pathogenic inflammatory monocyte macrophages, the IMMs, resulting in elevated lung cytokine and chemokine levels, vascular leakage, and impaired virus-specific T-cell responses, the classic cytokine storm. Now, genetic ablation of the interferon alpha-beta receptor or IMM depletion protects mice from lethal infection without affecting viral load. These results demonstrate that interferon 1 and IMM promote lethal SARS-CoV infection and identify interferon 1 and IMMs as potential therapeutic targets in patients infected with pathogenic coronavirus and perhaps other respiratory viruses. So there was a pretty good diagram that the cardiologist looked at and brought out as a basis for the understanding of severe disease with mild disease. And essentially, it was a graph showing the early interferon response or delayed interferon response or no interferon response with the outcome of the disease. And what it showed was that both the early interferon 1 response as well as no interferon 1 response actually brought about a mild outcome of infection with SARS-CoV-2, whereas a delayed response actually brought out the lung immunopathology and lethal pneumonias associated with all the fatalities of SARS-CoV, especially in the early days when they were ventilating people, when people were, quote unquote, dying en masse of this awful disease. So basically the interferon signaling was some part of their elucidation of how this was happening. And they also brought out that the concomitant disease, there was a kind of, not a triad, but more like there's like at least four parts of somebody's presenting situation which made them more likely to contract severe disease. Obviously things like age, obesity and comorbidities, other diseases were part of it. Interferon autoantibodies, which we can get into in a bit, were part of it. Having no recent exposure to any coronavirus and having weak mucosal immunity was part of it. And then a strong systemic immunity. So let me just explain this. A number of factors have to come together to cause severe disease. And I mentioned age, obesity and comorbidity. Interferon autoantibodies, which are high titers of neutralizing autoantibodies against type 1 interferon, both alpha and omega, the first and last beginning and end, And then strong systemic immune response, that's a delayed interferon response. Critically, no recent exposure to any coronavirus was also part of the problem. So
But
this
that's
is
so unusual when a lot of common colds are from coronaviruses. So how would there be some people who have never been exposed to any coronavirus?
well, it's recent exposure. It's not any. No, it's just
Oh.
recent. So
Oh,
I
just
think it had to
recently.
be, yeah, it had to be within the last month or 2 months.
Right.
Yeah. So this month or 2 months would be a classic example of how the immune system would be primed and would be ready to get on a fairly prompt interferon response. So in Africa, and the author brought this out as well, that Africa had probably one of the poorest rates and uptake of experimental drug in the world, and we're probably
You mean the
one of
experimental COVID vaccine?
yeah.
Okay.
And we're probably one of the places with the best outcomes. And so the author was saying, well, why is this? What's going on here? This is something that's, again, another elephant in the room. So not only the whole thing about 18 radio-labeled glucose showing up in the hearts of vaccinated people that were PET scanned, but why was it that Africa, who were both given the drug last and in the least amounts, had the best results? So anyway, what they're saying that in Africa in 2021, there was a high prevalence of pre-existing serological cross-reactivity against severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, and that was in sub-Saharan Africa. And a high proportion of individuals had already been exposed to other coronaviruses and therefore high levels of mucosal natural immunity, which would have prevented severe disease. So how, again, did Africa have such a good outcome from the pandemic when they were both lastly and least of all exposed to the experimental drugs? Now, he brings out now that a very important and critical point of this is the compound antibody IgG4. Now, IgG4 is a unique antibody in both structure and function. Now, this molecule accounts for less than 5% of the total IgG in healthy persons. And it's the least abundant IgG subclass out of all of them. It's found in higher levels in beekeepers who are continually exposed to bee venom, so the response is dampened. So IgG4 can be considered a tolerance antibody.
So it's like an antibody that your body makes to almost depress your immune system,
Yeah.
to lower the response so you
Things you
don't have an
shouldn't typically react
anaphylaxis.
to. Yeah.
That's what people should get if they're constantly getting stung by bees, not getting worse where they end up having anaphylaxis after a lot of bee stings.
So typically, spike protein binds to ACE2 receptors bound to the cell surface, but some individuals have free-floating ACE2 receptors also. Now, in severe COVID infection, the cytokine storm, which causes severe disease, is primarily occurring in the lungs, but the endothelia in general, in all the vasculature, will be affected. Free circulating spike protein can also bind to free-floating ACE2. Now, autoantibodies to ACE2 exist in a percentage of the population. When the immune system picks up ACE2 with spike attached, it creates antibodies to it, the autoantibodies to ACE2. Now, this is where it gets interesting. I think studies showed early on in the pandemic that IgG4 levels increased 4,000-fold as a result of the mRNA drug.
So that seems so odd. Why would a vaccine make your immune system suppressed?
Well, they weren't denying the fact that this quote-unquote vaccine did prevent severe disease. It did prevent severe disease, but what they're saying is the true cost of this experimental drug in terms of what it did with IgG4 levels is a smoking gun that is not yet hit. So, would we have I know the engineer's talking. I know somebody's called in, so.
So we had a caller who had super big, bad buzz on the background.
Uh-oh.
And so, I mean, not the kind that you induce yourself for the phone, you know?
Yeah.
And, and he asked if I could just simply ask you guys about the nattokinase that can be apparently used for cleansing the body. He
Yes.
wanted more information on that one.
Okay, I'll just quickly answer that, and
Go
then
ahead.
we'll
Yeah,
carry
go
on
ahead.
to try to finish this study before we
probably
have to wrap
won't
up.
have time to, but
So nattokinase is a blood thinner, and it can help with people who are suffering from blood clots at post-COVID vaccine. And that's, I think we mentioned that a while ago on a previous show. Aspirin is also helpful It's also a blood thinner. It's important if you take more than a baby aspirin a day to make sure you get 1 milligram of vitamin K2 per day to prevent too much blood thinning.
So getting back to IgG4, the very small amount of it normally is produced in response to infection. It's basically what you would call a tolerance antibody. So as I mentioned, the beekeepers typically who get repeatedly stung, they don't have any crazy reaction to it. And that's largely down to IgG4, which trains the immune system not to overreact to it. So the fact that people who get injected with this drug have a 4,000-fold increase in this particular class of IgG is interesting because it dampens down the immune system and its response. Now, with falling IgG4 levels, that protection no longer exists, increasing the inflammatory response. It's also been shown that the further away from revaccination a person is, the more severe can be their next exposure to SARS-CoV-2. So, how severe this falling level of IgG4 is to the vaccinated, we do not know at this point. Most likely, viral dissemination through tolerance responses will allow the virus to spread systemically throughout the body as it is not confronted, residing in the brain, muscle, heart, lungs, kidneys, liver, spleen, etc., waiting for the opportunity to break free. The tolerant antibody suppressing the immune system, then IgG4 falls. What will be the effect? I wanted to quickly say, I'll find out any more about this next month, but I wanted to mention that France, and you can't believe this, you say truth is stranger than fact, Sue? France have just passed, February the 11th of this year, Macron's wonderful government, who's going to be ousted by Marine Le Pen, by the way, France have just passed a law that anybody criticizing or critical of mRNA will be punishable in the future. A new criminal offence in France could in future land people in prison who encourage people to withhold appropriate medical treatment according to science. The law was pushed through the National Assembly on Wednesday. Critics call the law Article Pfizer. Now, it's punishable by 3 years in prison or up to €45,000. So politics are more important than science at this point, and questions are part of science. Free speech, as you mentioned, Sue, at the beginning of the show, so important to dialogue. The Macron regime got its way for now, although, as I said, populists like Le Pen are predicted to gain a wide victory and win the next election. So free speech is very important. We have to have it always. So that's the end of the show. You've been listening to Ask Your Herb Dr. KMUD Garberville 91.1 FM. Until the third Friday of next month, March, my name's Andrew Murray.
My name's Sarah Johannesson Murray.
You can always go check out our website, westernbotanicalmedicine.com, or our Twitter page or our YouTube channel. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next month.
Thank you and good night.